The theme for the conference is, of course, from the heart of Europe to the world of transplantation. The theme of this session is ESOT Meets the World. And we're absolutely delighted to have 4 incredibly distinguished visitors from all over the globe. And I'd like now, if I can, to call the distinguished visitors to the stage. What we are doing is something really slightly different, slightly unusual in terms of making sure that the audience is involved by bringing some of the audience up onto the stage. If I can invite our distinguished visitors to come up onto stage now, please. Thank you. Do come and take a seat. Take a seat. Hello.
Nephrology versus medicine.
It's okay. You don't need to leave a seat for me. So we have Chao Long Chen. Hello. From Taipei in Taiwan. So this very distinguished man, Superintendent Emeritus of Kaohsiung Changgung Memorial Hospital, did the first live donor liver transplant in Taiwan back in 1994, first split liver transplant in Asia in 1997, elected as an academician to the prestigious Chinese Academy of Engineering. So you're very welcome, sir. Walter Doro Garcia, a nephrologist, Director of Transplantation in Santa Casa Hospital, Porto Alegre, President of the Brazilian Transplant Society in the past, and also of the Southern Latin American and Caribbean Society in the past, and I think still present President of the International Society for Organ Donation and Procurement. Past as well. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. To Syed Ali Malek Hosseini, Professor of Surgery and Head of Organ Transplant Unit in the Shiraz University of Medical Sciences, performed, as I understand, the first kidney transplant from a deceased donor in Iran in 1992, first liver transplant in Iran in 1993, first split liver transplant in 1998, and I was always impressed in the past when Tom Starzl had a very short CV, and he just used to put on the bottom, I think, Man of the Year US or something. And he won it about 4 times in a row, I think. So this gentleman is Iranian Memorable Face, which he's won many times in a row. So thank you very much. And last but not least, my old friend Ros Manon, who is, this is wonderful, Professor of Medicine and Professor of Surgery in UAB, Alabama. And there can't be too many of those around. I do know one other, but there aren't too many of those around. Medical Director recently of Vets Affairs Medical Center, and of course, fairly recently past President of the American Society of Transplantation. So I think you'll agree, ladies and gentlemen, a fairly distinguished panel. So thank you very much indeed for coming. Now, as I said, we have brought some people from the audience up to the stage, but they're not just random people that we just sort of hooked up. There are some people here who were asked to, as abstract presenters, suggest questions for this distinguished panel, all right? And so there are some here. I apologize that I'm not going to be able to get questions from all of you, I'm afraid, because that would mean that we would go for many years. But perhaps we can start with Matthew Bottomley from Oxford, is that right? Okay, go.
As short-term organ transplant outcomes approach 100% survival, what can we do to ensure long-term graft survival improves?
Okay, so we're talking, Ros and gentlemen, about long-term graft survival. maybe, Professor Hosseini, we would start with you and cone it down very much more towards your situation. Maybe you tell us a little bit about the background that you have in Iran, because obviously a lot of us hear a lot about Iran and live donation, and you're much more involved on the deceased donation side. So maybe give us a little bit of background, and then we'll talk perhaps about the longer term problems that you may have for your patients.
For long term, everybody knows that the survival of transplantation, especially kidney survival, is quite close to the 100%. But we know that in the first year we use many potent immunosuppressions, and also in early phase of transplantation there is no opportunistic infections such as CMV, TB, and also malignancies. There is a lot of problem that survival of long term is not similar to the short term. And also we know that immune system is very complicated, and we have a lot of minor histocompatibility complex in the body with a lot of antibodies, and I think the survival of 1 year is very different for long term.
So in terms of your your particular problems in Iran, what difficulties do people have of say access to immunosuppression, for instance? Is that a problem or not a problem?
Not a problem. If you let me, and if you have some time, give me about 10 minutes or maybe a little more to show some slide about Iranian system and the situation of transplantation in our country. Maybe have some lessons for another country similar to us, because we have a very good donor donation system in Iran now. And the Iranian model that we use in the past is decreasing, and in our center we didn't transplant living and related kidney in our center from 2008.
So from 2008. So I mean, obviously we have a biased view because we don't hear everything that's going on. So we hear that in Iran there is the living donor program and the paid living donor program. So give us your view on that.
Oh, we are now distribute our system to all of our country, and if you look at to the result and to the situation in Iran in the last 10 years, you see that the Iranian model that they use living donor kidneys now is decreasing very much, and in many centers they stop the living and related donor. But we have this type of transplantation in our country in other places. Okay. And in our center, kidney transplantation is 92 or 94% from deceased donor in our center, because we use even marginal organs. And in liver is similar now, 90 to 92 is from the deceased donors.
Okay, so how have you been successful as in a deceased donor program? Because many countries around you and perhaps other areas within Iran have not been so successful. How have you done something that others have not?
I show in my slides that will show that from the cultural viewpoint, from the religious, from the education points, we have a very good background, especially religiously, because we take permission from Ayatollah Imam Khomeini just 26 years ago, and he gave fatwa and permit to us to use the organ from deceased donor, and this is the most important step in our history of transplantation.
So you use the religious aspect in a very positive way, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And how did you make that representation to the Ayatollah?
We are working 3 decades continuously. Okay. If one say the story of transplantation in our country, take more time that I think is out of time of this Congress. But we have a very hard job. We find small, narrow ways and go everywhere, and connect to everybody, scholars, celebrities, everyone. But the most important thing for us was the background, cultural background. You know that just about 500 years before the Christ, Cyrus the Great issued a human rights charter, and it is present in the London Museum, and I will show the picture to you.
Okay, okay. So there is a cultural foundation. There is a religious aspect which you used positively. You've used lots of publicity, which I guess a lot of people in the audience would say they did in their areas as well. But do you think that's it? Is there a magic factor to add in? Because others could easily do what you have done.
No, every country has its own problem. In our country, fortunately, we have very good people. We haven't opting out law, but we have about 98 or 190% consent in many areas in Iran. And I think in our province, the PMP is about 25. And in some town, it's 30 to 35. So it's more dependent to the culture, to the education. I will show, I was a teacher.
Right.
When I was 18 years old, I was a teacher in the tribal area under the tent. And I have a very nice picture from the Professor Barnard that visited the Shiraz about 45 years ago and visited one of these tents with Bahman Begi. That was one of the most important pictures in the education in our country.
Okay, so you feel that education is very important. I mean, I guess from the UK, we would say as well, in my own area of the UK, Scotland, that education within schools actually was really very, very important in promoting donation. Okay, okay. I don't want to direct all the questions to you, so we'll move on, but we'll come back because I think you opened up a number of different issues there. Latin America, so long-term graft survival versus short-term. You know, yeah, I guess if I wanted to paraphrase Matthew's question, I would say, yeah, we can all get the patient out to a year, as we hear. But what about the long-term, and what problems do you have in Latin America?
Yes, in Latin America, in our centers all the world, we lost about 4% of the patients after the first years. Half of them because of death of patient, cardiovascular, infectious disease for us is most important than cardiovascular. It's the first cause of patient death. Okay. And another half because of chronic rejection, non-adherence. It's a great problem with us because another recurrence of disease, same Bicavir virus, it's also in Latin America.
Okay, and just move your microphone just slightly.
Okay.
Okay, so in terms of problems with immunosuppression, over-immunosuppression, availability of immunosuppression, any issues there?
Yes, there is a study by Opel's registry some years ago that showed that in Latin America, the mortality for disease donors was higher than European because the higher use of prednisone doses.
Okay.
It was proved by registry some years ago. It's a problem. We have many patients dying from infectious disease, tuberculosis, another kind of disease.
Okay, and was there a reaction to that then? Was there a reaction by your colleagues to reduce immunosuppression or to alter immunosuppression in some way?
With this new immunosuppression that are used in all the world, it's not so important. I think in this moment for us, infection is a great problem.
Okay, okay, all right. So Dr. Chen, Professor Chen, so in Taiwan, I mean, you're mainly involved in liver transplantation, I understand. You've done many liver transplants over the years. Are you worried less about short-term survival because that is now reasonably good? Or what's your view about that?
Well, the great success in liver transplantation has brought about increase in demand of the liver graft. And the western and eastern part of the world cope differently with problem of organ shortage because Asia has the lowest deceased donor donation rate in the world. Yeah. While the Westerners campaign to promote deceased donor organ donation, the Easterners, they sharpen their skill and focus on living donor liver transplant as it is more acceptable in most Asian cultures. And with living donor liver transplant, I think it can be an elective surgery, so we can look even more in more detail to have better preparation for the long-term survival. For example, like co-antibody positive in my country, in my part of the world, can be up to 60% of the population. So in order, we are not looking at the short-term result. We need to look into the long-term result, like pediatric patients. They can easily get the co-antibody positive graft from the parent. Right. But in this way, we can well prepare by pre-transplant vaccination to achieve protective title of anti-HBs. So to avoid long-term 10 years, 20 years later, develop de novo hepatitis B. That's only an example. We can look in more detail to prepare for long-term survival.
And that's a very good example. So do you have a registry of your patients that you can follow very carefully? Yes. Yes. And who maintains that registry? Is that within the hospital or is that across the whole of Taiwan?
We are fortunate that we have a national health insurance that covers 99.7% of the population. So we keep that registry. And Taiwan is a small island. After surgery, 100% of the population will follow up at the original transplant hospital.
Okay, so it's quite a tight population. Forgive me, I don't know the population of Taiwan.
23 million.
23 million, thank you. Thank you for that. So Roz, what about the US? I mean, of course, a very well-developed country, so there's no problems with lack of immunosuppression at all.
Absolutely none, John. That was a leading question. So I think it's a very good question in terms of long-term graft failure because, at least in the kidney world, we don't have the endurance to do prospective data collection and wait 10 years to look at things. And so a lot of the data that we have is really based on some historical center studies and then some registry, that were established registries that cost several $1 million. And for example, DCAF, which is not currently maintained. And so, if you're trying to figure out mechanism, we're a little disadvantaged. And so I think that we need to be focusing. I mean, what a great advantage to have every patient in a registry.
Yeah, exactly.
Because, the United States data, the SRTR, is really a reporting registry, although many papers are written, the kind of granular data that's present in a registry where you're part of a system is really missing. And so there have been continued individual efforts to look at late graft failure in that regard. And the other issue in terms of medication is that, this Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, was supposed to fix any issues in kidney. In kidney, you have 3 years of medicines and then you're stopped, you're cut off. And it has in some ways, and it has in not. It's very state-specific across the United States. It has a lot to do with patient income, whether they can afford to have affordable care or not. And so we still see non-adherence as a major issue due to affordability of medications. Probably, when you're looking late in our patient population, about 15–20%.
So we chaired a session, didn't we, together, where we said, let's look at the results of Europe, let's look at the results of the US.
Right.
And actually, Europe did better. And I think the the sort of bottom line of that was actually the availability of immunosuppression. Is that right?
And I think that's in a good part, that is one of the issues. I think as a field, though, I know this for me personally, when you have someone that's very stable, you really you're not really maintaining levels and being really compulsive like you are in the first year or 3 years. And as patients, unlike liver, our patients don't necessarily come back, but maybe once a year when they get further out. And you really do lose touch with what is going on a day-to-day basis. And so it's a constant challenge for us to figure out how to follow a large patient population with a lot of detail without, getting into the local physician's, business and, being, talking down to our colleagues as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I visited UAB and it was a very valuable experience. I think we should probably move on to another question, so thank you, panel, on that. So may I come to Linda Wright to ask a question? Linda, can you ask a question, please?
Thank you. So my question is about living donation, and I'm interested in how we establish acceptable limits of risk for living donors. And I'd like to ask whether you think that psychosocial and economic factors should be part of that evaluation as well as the medical factors.
So, I mean, we've talked about living donation. We've talked about, we've touched on that a little bit, but I think the question here is focusing on perhaps also, maybe you're thinking about some of the recent results that there have been, some papers that there have been in terms of longer-term outcome of living donors, and also from the liver side, I guess the risk balance is very different. The stakes are much higher, both for the donor and the recipient. So let's maybe start with Professor Chen in terms of live donation and liver. You said deceased donation. Let me almost paraphrase you. Let me say you almost had given up on deceased donation. It has to be live donation, but that is quite risky for the donor. How do you go through the psychosocial and other assessments for your patients?
Yes, there's also a question, should living donors transplant can be extended like a palliative transplant? I think the point is we need to remember that in living donation, we are putting the life of a healthy donor into risk. So to justify this risk, the outcome of the recipient must be acceptable. And that the recipient we have, that they can get well and return to the community and also then contribute to the society. So this is the concept of double equipoise come into play. Where the satisfaction of the donor from the act of organ donation must equate with the satisfaction of the recipient, and which is, we need to consider also the recipient recipient's need, benefit, and also the urgency of need and the overall satisfaction. So I think the satisfaction, the long-term outcome of the donor, we need to consider also can be very complex, because donor risk must be always weighed against recipient benefit and urgency of need and overall donor satisfaction. And the acceptable risk in the donor should include also medical, psychosocial, and also economic element, because they need to be absent from their work. And this might entail a possible income-related program. But in most Asian countries, the living donation also covered by the National Health Insurance. And we know that in Canada, even it's not only the cost of operation, but also the absence from work in the process of donation also can be reimbursed as an incentive.
Okay, okay. So also from the Latin American, I guess more the kidney side, you're talking about, has there been concern from colleagues about the recent papers that there have been about donation, which I guess are challenged partly, but has there been concern there, and therefore, how do you react in terms of the question that was posed?
Yeah. In Latin America and in Brazil mainly, different from Europe and the United States, we are decreasing the number of transplants with living donor for kidney. In Brazil, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we used the 12 living transplants per million population. In last year, it was less than 8.
So that's quite a change. So what do you think has brought that about?
It decreases because there is a great increase in disease donation. We have 10 years ago, we have 4 or 5 donors per million population. In this year, we have 15. Disease only brain death. We use only brain death donors. And we have more brain death than in other countries. But we use only related donation. In Brazil, it's not forbidden, but it's very difficult to use non-related donated. The legislation is very strict. Because the social problems, we are afraid to use, liberated to use of living donor unrelated. And in my opinion, there is a risk, small, but there is a risk for the living donor, 1 for 3,000. I can accept this risk for my son, for my wife, but not for you.
Yeah, okay. I won't take that personally, but okay. I mean, I understand that, but also I guess if you're acting as a doctor for the donor, you have to sometimes almost protect the donor from themselves. I mean that you must have had that, Professor Chen, whenever you feel that the donor is particularly at risk. And the donor still wants to donate because they're desperate to help their recipient. What do you do in those circumstances? You don't feel it is right, but they are desperate to donate.
Well, we always need to protect the donor because even the donor is physically fit to donation. If there's a hesitation, we always told the donor that we can always find a medical excuse for you to escape the donation and to avoid any pressure from the family. So that's always our practice. So if there's any risk factor, we cannot risk the donor for the benefit of the recipient. Even physically, he's fit for the donation, but psychologically, he's hesitant. But because of the pressure, the coercion from the family, he cannot say no. In this situation, we always find the medical excuse for the donor.
Okay, okay. So you find a way out of it, is what you're saying?
Like which vessel is or bioduct is not suitable, something like this.
Okay, okay, okay. Ros, what about in the States? A reaction to the recent papers, or do you feel that it's very much the same business as usual?
There's, I think, 2 issues to highlight in the States. The first is that living donation rates have remained stable, if not slightly down, really over the last 5 years. And, you know, the crucial steps of educating for living donation have come from organ procurement organizations, some health centers, the societies, but the federal government has not put the energy into that. And that's been one area that the American Society of Transplantation this year has been working with, you know, HRSA DOT, the Department of Transplantation under Health and Human Services, to try to create this issue to the Secretary's attention that living kidney donation has really been quite limited. I think the other issue that's come to light is the lack of social support. We have requirements by UNOS to have living donor advocates. So the psychological evaluation occurs, the social evaluation occurs, and all those pieces go in hoping that we do something safe. But it's not uncommon that patients become unemployed for whatever reason. They lose their job. It's very difficult for these patients to access medical care when and if. And that's something that I don't think we do a good job. I think in response to that, there are 2 bills in Congress that we're working on passing that would have more insurability for the patient's long-term outcome who donates, and that includes, you know, mandatory follow-up that's maybe in a registry, for example, like bone marrow transplant donors, and also insurance that may be a simple insurance policy that protects them from any complications of their surgery or the long-term complications of ESRD. And then my last point, because I could talk all day, is the recent studies about the APOL1 risk mutation. So in the United States, patients with African ancestry that have this mutation, which is related to infections, schistosomiasis in the past, malaria, I'm sorry, we found that there's a high risk of end-stage renal disease in this patient population, and there's emerging data that if individuals of African ancestry have both of these mutations, that they have a much higher risk of developing kidney failure or the graft doing poorly. So the National Institutes of Health had a meeting to discuss the whole biology of this mutation, but there's a huge outcry now from several centers that this should be part of a consent process to both the donor as well as the recipient, that maybe we should be typing everyone, deceased donor and living donor, adding it to the allocation scheme, having patients who are on the waiting list for a long time decline those kidneys, and so forth. And I think that's a little bit out of control, but I think the idea of being able to recognize patients at risk, personalizing, you know, the genomic outcomes, there are a lot of end-stage kidney disease-associated genes that maybe we should be, as a community, looking into to determine someone that's going to be at high risk, and maybe some of that, the increase in risk we see is definable but small. Maybe those are the patients that we could define and exclude them and have another reason to say, hey, we're not going to do you. It's not socioeconomic, it's you have a biological issue.
And how about that difficult decision that I put to Professor Chen, which is, you know, where the donor desperately wants to help, in the way Walter said, you know, if it's for my son or my daughter, I desperately want to do it. But you're saying, look, I've got your gene array here, you really shouldn't be doing this. And they're saying, well, I want to do it, I don't care, get out of the way. What do you do then?
So, you know, that will be in the future. We may have these arrays, but we find that now. You find someone with hyperglycemia or high blood pressure, and the issue in the U.S. is, unlike a smaller country, although here there's quite a number of centers, but, you know, when we turn a donor down and say it is not in your interest, they just go somewhere else, and then they come back and say, here I am. Here's my scar or my scars, and here's my recipient, and now you take care of them. And, you know, you don't have as much control. I mean, we do advise patients quite bluntly when they should and should not donate, and I do think that our center tends to be fairly conservative, but not everyone is that conservative.
Okay, thank you. I will come to you in a minute, Professor Hosseini. I'm just aware that I haven't taken too many questions, so I better get back to our audience. Olivier Thanau, I think, has a question. Olivier? Get the microphone to Olivier.
Thank you very much. I had a question for Dr. Chen. I heard that they were very successful with their living program, and I was wondering how they can expect to go further than that. Do they intend, for example, to follow the steps of Korea and build a deceased donor program, or what are their plans for the future in Taiwan?
Okay, so I guess, Professor Chen, that's touching on something that we've been saying to you already, is that it's a very successful live donor program. Have you, I suppose, being a slightly rude question from me earlier on, is have you given up on the deceased donor side?
I think living donor program and deceased donor should be complementary, not competitive, not competing. Like every year, our center, we been performing 130 living donor liver transplant, but previously, we used to have very few deceased donor, an average of 6 deceased donor per year. That's very few. But even it's very few, I think it's very precious. So we try every effort to split transplant, to divide into two, to give to two recipients. But even with this few number of deceased donors, we used this to salvage quite a lot of very difficult cases, particularly for the retransplant. As you know, the retransplant, liver retransplantation can be very difficult because living donor can provide very short hepatic artery and portal vein, which cannot be salvaged by transplant with living donor. And this very difficult case can be salvaged by deceased donor, whether it's a whole organ or split liver transplant.
Okay.
And we continue to do this. This year, so far, in the past 8 months, we have 20 deceased donor liver transplant.
How many,
so
sorry?
This year.
How many, sorry?
20.
20.
In the last 8 months. So it should be complementary, not competing. And the final goal should be no living donor need to donate their liver.
Okay. And we've heard from Professor Hosseini about there was a cultural background, there was a religious background, very much the same as in parts of Asia, and there's a pushback against deceased donation. Have you seen any possibility of getting around those problems?
Well, I do think so. It's very difficult, but traditionally, most of the Asian tradition, culture, and religion did not really support or encourage deceased donor donation. But as time goes by, I think the people change in mind. Like I said, this year, only my center, we have 20 deceased donor liver transplant in the past 8 months.
So
small
steps,
yes.
Small steps. Okay, and Professor Hosseini, I guess from the live donor, deceased donor side of things, you indicated that you decided as a unit not to carry on with the live donor from 2008, from the anonymized donors or the, however you want to call it. Why was that decision? Was that because you had been so successful on the deceased donor side that you were able to make that shift? What was the change?
I think the first thing that is how much is your belief as to do deceased donor, because you have an example in Persian that if you want, you can. I think if the transplantation teams everywhere in the world resist to don't use more living, because nobody in this hall accepts to be a living donor. And I always afraid to remove an organ from a person because we have a very big door that is, this is donor. We should go from this door because it's very safe. There is no stress, there is no risk for a donor. But if we go similar to US, they did everything that they can for this is donor donation. Of course, I think that the Belgium system and Spain is a very good example that they use. This is donor donation from brain death and DCD donation after cardiac death. We should go to this big safe door. And if we couldn't narrow the gap between the demand and the recipient and the donation, we can go to the living, small living door.
Okay.
But I think we, in other parts of the world, even in our country, if in a transplant center, the team was believed to do this is donor donation, the center is growing with time, and if in another city, another center with the same culture and the same religious, the percentage of this is donor is very low. Therefore, I think the most important thing that is the surgical team, transplant team, should be very careful and should have a beliefness that they can do transplantation from deceased donor, and persuade the people, go to the scholars, everywhere that they think that in my country, maybe the scholars or teachers or some person else, but in Taiwan may have another culture, but I think it is possible.
So give me a feel for the size of your program now in the last few years.
I think in next few years, the gap between demand and request is very narrow, and we use mostly, this is donor transplantation. I think our center nearly stop in kidney, we stop in liver, we have 2 transplant, some very small baby that very bad condition from the parents. We talk a lot about the risk of donation, both in the donor and in the recipient. But I think it is possible if we believe that we can do transplantation from this donor, we can go from this very difficult way, and we can remove all hurdle and overcome our barriers.
Okay, so how many transplants has your unit done in the last few years?
Do you permit that I show some slides?
I haven't got the capacity to show you slides. Just tell me the figures in the last few years.
Few years, just in total, 2014, we did nearly 500 liver transplantation in our center, 310, 12 kidneys, about 30 pancreas, and about 10 or 12 small bowel and multivisceral.
And is that all DBD transplants, DBD rather than DCD?
Mostly, all is brain-dead.
Only brain-dead?
Yes, because okay. DCD needs some equipment, need standby teams. We are ready to organize a team for the DCD in the near future, but no, because in our country, unfortunately, we have a very, very high road accidents. No, it is less than previous decade, but no, the brain dead percent is very high. So I think in our country we can do transplantation, the majority of our patients from the deceased donor.
Okay, okay, thank you very much. And I have a question from Gabi Aniscu.
Thank you, John. Organ allocation remains a controversial topic, and despite many commonalities, there are many differences to account for cultural differences between your respective countries. You also represent deceased donor programs at different levels of development. What do you think are the main challenges in selecting the criteria for allocation in each of your own countries?
So, who wants to take that up? Ros, do you want to take that up?
I'm not sure that I have all the brilliance here in this topic, but at least certainly, you know, in the U.S., most programs have DCD opportunities. It's a very, very small, minor population. The vast majority are DBD kidneys. And I think one of the issues that we're struggling with now, at least in kidney allocation, is the lung allocation is set. The liver, you can comment, is pretty well set. And heart is set, but the kidney allocation, because the supply-demand is so disparate, you know, we have 85,000 active kidney. There's 110, but that's the inactive. And we'll do 19,000 of those people a year, and we can keep adding. So in that context, the new allocation scheme was integrated in December on the 4th of this past year, a completely new point system that both took a risk as the donor in terms of their age, their gender, other diseases that they may have, and then try to take the best of those kidneys and put them in the best recipients. So there's scores calculated on each recipient with the idea that if you put a good kidney in a good recipient, you'll get more lifespan for that kidney. And I think we're struggling now. We have a lot of older, and you can use your definition, what's older, but we have older individuals that are getting called in for not great kidneys. And we're getting not some great kidneys for people that are highly sensitized. The one thing the allocation scheme did fix is we're getting a lot more calls about highly sensitized patients, and you can imagine the struggles of getting, you know, AMR in a kidney that's sort of on the skids to begin with. So I think we've had our own inherent challenges, and again, the issue becomes we don't have enough supply. I mean, and we're doing, you know, I'm excited about the meeting because we're talking about reparative medicine, we're talking about stem cells, you know, those may be options of, you know, lowering the discard rate in our country. That's a big issue for us. We are studying it by center, but I think those are ways of, you know, increasing the potential supply.
Okay.
I'm not sure that answers his question, but
it's getting towards that, certainly. And Walter, from the Latin American side, from the South American side, is it all DBD donation, or is it DCD? Is it very marginal donors that are resulting in transplantation in Brazil, for instance?
In Brazil, we use yet this allocation system based principally in HLA. There are points for timing in the waiting list, high sensitivity patient, but we use mainly the HLA. There is a national list in Brazil with a regional, because it's a that big country, each state has its waiting list, but it is national, and they use mainly the HLA, but I think we will change in next years. We are observing the new system of the United States, and we try to change in next years.
So you're about to change your allocation system again, because they need updated from time to time. So Professor Chen, from your point of view, I mean, obviously DBD versus DCD, do you think that the cultural problems that there are with deceased donation, do you think that those would be better with DCD, in that I know there are problems in terms of liver transplantation there, but you can understand that people may have a difficulty with the concept of brainstem death, but when somebody is clearly dead by normal circulatory methods, then there may be less of a problem. I don't know, but is that the case?
Well, Taiwan is easier because 23 million population in a small island is all online registration of a transplant candidate, and it's transparent, and it's basically DBD. But I think in Brazil, they have a very good system to promote pediatric liver transplant, because pediatric pill point, pediatric case, the score, they point three times. So the pediatric liver transplant recipient can much easier to get the graft. Yeah. So they force them to split, and another adult also benefit. This is quite unique in Brazil.
Okay, okay, all right. And we've already heard Professor Zedi, I mean, are you planning to go into DCD donation at all, or do you feel that because DBD is satisfactory that you will leave it there?
No, we are going to DCD in future, but maybe in our center.
Okay.
And this is one of the most effective way to show, to cover the shortage of organ donation.
Okay.
It is better than going to the living. My comment is many of them, because everybody talk about that every day the kidney disease is rising, liver disease is the same. I think we should go to the prevention, because you know, even in liver transplantation and in liver donors, about 10% to 12%, sometimes 20% of cases are most fatty, and we cannot use the liver. So I think we should pay money budget on the prevention related to transplantation. We cannot cover this gap anytime, especially if we want going to the living. Morally and ethically is not a good way.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm aware that time is going on, so I think at this stage I will draw this section to a close. I think I will simply thank both the questioners, but also the speakers. I think we've heard that right at the end there about prevention and prevention being important. We've also heard from Professor Mannon about the need for looking into the future, and I hope we will do that elsewhere in the conference. But for now, I think I simply want to say to our 4 very distinguished panelists, I'm very grateful to them for coming, and thank you very much indeed. Thank you.